For the most part, if you're looking at Operation Crossroads wrecks, that means Bikini Atoll, Saratoga, Arkansas, Nagato, and so forth. If you want to actually dive one of these historic wrecks, it means going to that island, with one rather notable exception. USS Prinz Eugen, the German war prize turned American test ship. This famous cruiser survived both of the Crossroads tests with minimal damage in July 1946. As a result, the heavily irradiated hulk was towed off to Kwajalein. At this point, radiation aside, Prinz Eugen was still in pretty good shape, with the exception of a small leak. That leak would ultimately grow far worse by December of 1946. As the ship began to list severely on December 21st, a boarding party rushed aboard to find a busted sea valve rapidly flooding the cruiser. Tugs attempted to take Prinz Eugen in tow, but they lacked the power to beach her, a situation made worse by high winds. As a result, Prinz Eugen would ground on a coral edge as the flooding progressed, before ultimately rolling over and capsizing around midnight on December 22nd. In the initial aftermath of the sinking, the Navy declared Prinz Eugen salvageable. In the strictest, can this ship be refloated sense. However, as a surplus war prize, this wasn't likely to begin with. The radiation was the final nail in the coffin. The Navy had no desire or incentive to raise a radioactive hulk when they were dealing with enough of those as is. So Prinz Eugen was left in place to rust away, where in the intervening decades she has become a popular diving spot. The radiation is mostly gone by this point, and if you can get out to Kwajalein, Prinz Eugen is a well-known dive, although one of the props was removed and is now on display in Germany. And the Navy, in 2018, went back to the wreck to drain much of the remaining oil. Otherwise, though, Prinz Eugen is much the same as when she sank, obvious rusting aside. Let's look at the wreck now. I will link the sources of the following photographs in the description. And if you're interested in the ship's history, I have 2 videos that I'll link as well. One on her full service career, and a shorter one focused on the ship's time as USS Prinz Eugen. Now for the wreck. The first thing you'll see here is the stern poking out of the water. This is one of the more famous shipwreck pictures, period. Even if you don't know what ship it is, you've probably seen this before. The rusty rudder, the exposed shaft and prop, and the rounded stern beneath the surface. Notably, if you look from the other side, you can see more. The orientation the ship is resting at, for example. She's not completely inverted. Prinz Eugen rests at a slight angle. You can also see the empty shaft where the screw in Germany used to be. The other 2 are still in place, with one underwater and the other above the surface. In the case of this picture, you can also see where the hull is resting away behind the empty shaft. The increased damage here is almost certainly due to wave action. While a sheltered lagoon, there are still tides, and that would increase the speed of corrosion on the wreck. This makes an interesting comparison to older pictures like this one. This was taken at some point before 1979, when the third prop was removed and taken to Germany. The corrosion on the hull is nowhere near as extensive, as you'd probably expect from 30 years after she sank to 70 years. This one looks even older, and not just because it's black and white. There's very little visible rusting, so this was likely taken when the ship was still recently sunk. To round off these pictures, there's this one, which seems to be between the other 2, at least judging from the amount of rusting. It's hard to say for sure without being able to see the back of the shaft. Either way, I find these interesting, because you don't normally see pictures from this far back. Most pictures of the wreck are from the 21st century, like, for example, this one. It's a close-up of the shaft above water. There's an interesting rusting pattern on the shaft itself. The prop, meanwhile, is a uniform color, except where the tide submerges. and the rudder here seems to be a bit rough, although you can only see part of it. With that done, let's move on to the underwater side. Most, although not all of these pics, come from the Dirty Dozen blog, starting right where we left off with the stern here. This is just below the surface, so it's very well lit. And while coral has certainly colonized the wreck, it's actually surprisingly clear of marine growth. The shape of the stern remains completely recognizable from the deck here to the bottom now near the surface, and the shafts barely visible here. Now, moving further along the hull, you can start to see underneath the ship. Prinz Eugen landed in such a way that you can, for at least part of the length, swim beneath the ship, which is freaky to me, but probably quite interesting to experienced divers. More importantly, though, it lets you see the main guns. The turrets fell out as the ship capsized, but due to the shallow water, the rest of the hull landed on top of them. So you have the turrets, as you can see here, resting just outside their barbettes. This means you can see the turret, the barbette, and the mechanisms that are normally inside the ship. Seeing turrets like this is already a rare sight, but this is even more distinctive, especially if you're a fan of German ships, because this is about the only way to see German turrets at all. While not part of the turret, there's also an open hatch here. This is often used to penetrate into the hull, which we'll come back to later. First, more of the turrets. This image from a different source shows another angle, a closer in look at the turret itself. This is admittedly blurry, but you can see where the barrels poke out a bit better here, as well as the turret face itself. From the same source, we have this picture from further back, which I find more interesting because it shows the second stern turret, the super firing one, which has fallen a bit further out. As a result, more of the interior is visible, and in front of it, you can also see the side of the other turret, including an intact ladder here. This is also the only picture of the super firing turret that I could find. And on that topic, this is the only picture of the 105mm guns that I could locate. It's resting on its side with the barrels poking out of a mess of coral. Unfortunately, it doesn't show the mount itself. I did find a dive video that shows more, which I'll link in the description. As for the other weaponry, there's two pictures of note. This one of one of the flak mounts. While pretty badly rusted and overgrown, the mount is still recognizable, and the 4 barrels remain in place as well. Even the gun shield is still here, although that's in rougher shape. The general area of the ship is in similarly bad shape, but for being nuked twice and left in shallow water for 80 years, certainly not terrible. The same holds true for the torpedo tubes here. While you can only see one of the tubes, it's still in one piece. Even the torpedo is still there, which is probably not safe to be swimming close to. I'll touch on this again later, but live ordnance still has the potential to explode. If anything, it's less stable after rusting away for so long. 99% of the time, it's probably safe to take a picture, but it's still not something you should play around with. In any case, though, the mount, with its torpedo, is still attached to the deck. It hasn't fallen off, at least when this picture was taken. Beneath it, however, things are less pretty. A lot of twisted metal and debris. Definitely not the prettiest picture of the wreck, to say the least. On the other hand, as we move inside, there is some remarkable preservation. Like, for instance, intact cabinet space. This is, of course, upside down. This would have been on the floor, but is now the ceiling, which means the tea kettles are definitely something put there by divers, as they wouldn't have been in that position on the surface. They're on the bottom of the frame, not the top. It does still make for a striking image, especially with how well preserved those are as well. As for the ceiling, that is now the floor, that's pretty good too. It's not easy to see here, but there's very little degradation considering how long it's been there. Some silt and missing panels, but for the most part, it's not that bad. And then you have the next picture where we have an intact table. I imagine this was made of linoleum or something of that nature and not wood. Even so, it's still impressive. Other than the stuff dripping from it, the table is in one piece, from the mounting point to the table itself, although the mounting is arguably the more impressive bit. 80 years underwater, and that hasn't failed. The rest of this room is rougher, with a lot of rusting and collapsed debris. I think this was storage of some sort here, but I'm not sure. And these look like busted cabinets. Rough or not, this is still pretty good for how long the ship has been underwater, and in such shallow water as well. The next two interior shots for their part aren't quite as impressive. Still interesting, yes, but not as impressive. This one has a sink that fell to the floor and a set of portholes, along with scattered bits of debris. And this one is kind of like that one shot on the Hermes wreck, where you could look inside and see a set of toilets. Only this time, it's from inside and only a single toilet. Not the most flattering picture, maybe, but still a bit of a funny one. On the less funny side of things, you have a set of spare torpedoes. These are still in place, rusting away. The same thing I said earlier about the torpedo tube applies here. Even more so, actually, because you've got quadruple the risk of something going boom if you're unlucky. The other source, for its part, has a shot of the front, which does confirm that all 4 torpedoes still have their warheads. Not surprising, because all the Crossroads ships were loaded up with live ammunition to test how they reacted to the bombs. With that, however, we come to the end of the video. First, with a picture here of the bow, resting silently on the bottom at a slight angle. That angle, in addition to being inverted, is why penetrating the wreck is discouraged. It's very easy to lose your sense of direction, even if you know what you're doing. And then we have the final picture. The superstructure collapsed to the side and pancaked into the bottom. As the cruiser rolled over, this was pushed to the side, just like Nagato. And, just like that wreck, it makes for a striking image on the bottom. Prinz Eugen does that in general. This is one of the more interesting wrecks that is available to relatively casual divers. If you can afford the trip, of course. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.